All right, good afternoon. I'm Tim Klont, the Director of Housing and Outreach on LISC's National Rural Team. Our team works with and through approximately 150 partners that are transforming rural communities in more than 2,400 counties across 49 states and Puerto Rico. And welcome to the launch of Raising the Roof. Through this webinar series, we will share innovations, trends, best practices, and thought leadership from our industry colleagues as we work together to create quality, affordable housing opportunities. Today's discussion will focus on the intersection of affordable housing and affordable broadband and preview a new LISC resource titled Affordable Housing Developers Broadband Handbook. And I'll drop a link to an abridged version of that handbook in the chat momentarily. All of our webinar participants have been muted. However, we welcome your thoughts, reactions, and questions, so please submit them via the chat function, and I'll pose as many of them to our speakers as time allows. Now, I'd like to introduce my colleague and today's discussion leader. Christa Vinson leads the Broadband and Infrastructure pillar at Rural LISC, which is a multi-pronged strategy to increase the digital support available in the social safety net and to deliver the economic opportunity, employment, and placemaking benefits of broadband internet infrastructure in rural America. Christa.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's a real pleasure to be here today. Today's conversation is indeed about raising the roof on an issue we felt warranted more attention, and that's the opportunity for broadband access and digital opportunity advocates to find common cause with affordable housing advocates. Home is where we literally and physically connect, where we are rooted, but as the pandemic showed, connection these days has become virtual by necessity. Connections to healthcare, to work, to education, to social supports, all aspects of life now have a digital dimension. And LISC is well known and as a longtime advocate and investor in quality, affordable housing for low-income and vulnerable residents in underserved communities. Recently, LISC and Rural LISC have done more to look at ways that this cornerstone of our mission confronts an interconnected world that increasingly relies on high-speed internet. According to Pew Research Center, 90% of US adults report that the internet is important to them, but millions of households can't afford access to the internet. And according to Microsoft, as many as 150 million or so households don't regularly access the internet at broadband speeds, modern broadband speeds. These are real barriers for our nation's lowest income households and vulnerable communities. So it was a great privilege for me to support Rural LISC Commission of the Affordable Housing Developers Broadband Handbook from CTC to demystify this issue and to offer relevant and timely information on this urgent topic. We couldn't have done better than to find a partner in CTC in this work. The firm is in a communications and IT engineering consultancy that has advised public sector and nonprofit clients throughout the United States. LISC was so pleased to work with Ziggy Rivkin-Fish, who unfortunately could not join us today due to a last-minute scheduling conflict, and Miriam Gillow-Wiles to help our network of affordable housing owners, operators, lenders, investors, and allies understand how to plan for, pay for, and advocate for robust connectivity options and really the entire value stream of digital equity in their residential communities. This effort was inspired in large part by what we heard in our conversations with our partners. What is the best way to get internet to our residents? There are different ways to approach it, but where's the best place to start? The solutions, they told us, would need to work on the development side financially, while also offering the best support for tenants. And I'm really delighted that Miriam and Michelle could join us today because they have the answers, or will at least stimulate your thinking on this topic. I'd like to briefly introduce them, and then we'll start the discussion. Miriam Gillow-Wiles is Senior Broadband Strategy Analyst at CTC. Previously, she served as executive director of the Southwest Colorado Council of Governments, which happens to be the builder of the first regional broadband network in Colorado. She provided many broadband training courses and written materials for public officials at all levels in that role, and that's continued at CTC. She also has experience managing a regional housing authority. So very grateful to Miriam for being here today, and also appreciative of her efforts as co-author on the handbook. Michelle Harati is Senior Program Officer at the National LISC Policy Team. She advocates for federal policies to broaden pathways to opportunity, supporting multiple LISC national programs, including economic development, small business, workforce development, financial capability, creative placemaking, AmeriCorps, and of course, my favorite, digital inclusion. So without further ado, would love to get started in a conversation. We'll go for about half an hour and then some question and answer. So to level set, would love to ask Michelle to get us started. Many folks in the audience today do come from the housing world, and would love if you could offer some grounding in the LISC point of view on why digital inclusion is an emerging priority for us and our peers in the community development space.
Sure. Thanks, Christa, and thanks so much to everyone for being here with us today. Throughout LISC's 40-year history as an intermediary organization and community development financial institution, we've learned that people thrive when their communities are supplied with a set of interconnected physical, social, and economic assets. And so given this comprehensive approach, we see digital inclusion as a critical piece of this work that really pairs well and is necessary alongside other investments in affordable housing, community and economic development programs, and broader initiatives for better health, safer public spaces, and much more. I think that's really started to come to a head, as perhaps for many in this room, with the onset and the continuation of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we've come to better understand how we and our community-based partners can be part of the solution of addressing the longstanding need for reliable and affordable home broadband internet connections, the appropriate devices to use them, and the skills to use them for each and every individual and family in the country. We're also particularly struck by the disproportionate impacts, health and economic impacts of the pandemic on historically marginalized communities, which many in the community development field have long sought to support. So in turn, I think this led many more of us to understand that to close the longstanding racial health and wealth disparities, that we also need to understand and address how a lack of access to the internet can be the start of a domino effect that for many in many communities that rely on internet for education, employment, health, housing, and other essential services, being on the wrong side of the digital divide really exacerbates existing inequities, and it complicates the ability of community development practitioners to really deliver comprehensive programming. So furthermore, as an intermediary, we're also unique in being able to convene what at times might seem to be disparate stakeholders. And so driving towards change through meaningful partnerships to meet pressing needs. And so we've seen that digital inclusion has really become a key priority for many in the field. And so that as we work to close the digital divide, we're really working to expand the health, wealth, and educational opportunities of families across the country. And we know that there's too many families, estimates of about 42 million people in the US still lacking access to reliable broadband that's affordable, and that we need to work to close this, particularly within tribal and low-income communities and communities of color and recent immigrants, that this is really a pervasive issue that we're working to solve. And in short, the shorter version of this longer answer, it seems like it's become an emerging priority because there's a broader understanding that if we want to build resilient communities of opportunities, we really need to include digital inclusion activities. And that's not just about broadband deployment, but also the skills and affordability. And also how can we look at doing this in a comprehensive way that really leverages some of the other investments we have in affordable housing and broader economic development projects. And so one of the key things that we see here as a need is we understand that for many of the communities and rural counties that we serve, there's often a disconnect from being able to access federal opportunities. And so how can LISC and our community-based partners really help us serve to meet that gap, to make sure that with this historic investment of federal funds through the Infrastructure Act, that we're able to direct those resources to the communities that need it most. So I think it's somewhat of a natural fit, although maybe it won't seem so immediately when we're thinking about community development and the digital divide.
Yeah, thank you so much. And really what resonated there was solving for digital equity is solving for the health, wealth, and education gaps in our communities. And I know, Miriam, we've worked in a lot of communities with CTC and in your prior role, so I'd love for you to add on here. You've been active in communications and information technology engineering, or the CTC has been more or less since the dawn of the commercial internet. But you'd agree that there is something unique about this moment. So leading into the audience of housing developers, operators, and allies that we have in our audience today, why should they be paying attention to digital access issues now? And unmute, please. Someone had to be first.
That helps a bit. So, I mean, what we've been saying over the last, 2 years is that we're in unprecedented times. And that also is equated to the funding that we have right now for both digital equity and infrastructure development. And yeah, I personally have not been involved with the internet since the dawn of the internet. Close, but I'm maybe not quite that old.
CTC, the firm.
Yeah. So that's one of the major issues is there's now funding to do this. When before there wasn't a lot of funding available to support retrofitting or infrastructure for new housing development, whether that be affordable or otherwise. And I really think Michelle she hit the nail on the head, is that the reasons that this is important is because of that health, wealth, and educational opportunities and creation of those resilient communities that were already having challenges prior to a pandemic. And then we add a pandemic in there, and it's shown a really harsh light on a lot of these inequalities and inequities. So it does allow folks to access educational and economic opportunities to maybe change their station in life or get a different job. And it also allows for access to resources that a lot of folks in affordable housing may need, such as VA benefits or SNAP applications, WIC applications, things along those lines that have now moved to online and are almost impossible to do on a smartphone. It also allows students, your K through 12 and your higher education, to get that education. And all that's really important. And then on top of that, the Digital Equity Act within the Infrastructure Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the acronym is IIJA, which I may use, and if I do, somebody slap me, because I'm going to try not to use too many acronyms as possible. But the program priorities are individuals living in households earning at below 150% of the poverty line, veterans, aging individuals, incarcerated individuals, individuals with language barrier, disabilities, members of racial or ethnic minority groups, and individuals who reside in primarily rural areas. So it's a lot of the folks that also have access challenges of just getting to the internet, that deployment of infrastructure to their location, that skills, and then access to technology to be able to use the internet. I'd like to take a second, though, to provide a few definitions for the audience, because it can be kind of technical, and I don't want to use words or acronyms that make it inaccessible for folks. So one of the major things that we're going to talk about, or that I may mention, is going to be speed. And there's an up versus down. So right now, we talk about speeds of down is a consumption mode, right? Like, you're watching this and listening to me talk and opine about broadband, you're consuming it. But the upload is me sitting in my home office, sending it out to you all. So that's the difference between upload and download. Previously, we tended to consume more than we sent out. So that's a lot of like Netflix and TikTok videos and things along those lines, while we sent out more emails, TikTok videos, posting things to Instagram. The pandemic obviously changed all that. I think we've probably heard that for a couple of years now. But when we plunked everybody at home with multiple computers doing multiple video calls, it became really, really apparent that that previous standard of speed was too low. I mean, how many of us have all been on a video call and had a kid or another family member in the house, use the internet at the same time and it just crashes because we're using too much bandwidth? That's speed. So part of the Infrastructure Act increased, actually it quadrupled the previous requirements of the FCC of speed. And that's a huge thing because in marginalized communities and rural areas, the infrastructure did not maintain the speeds that the FCC wanted as well. And so now that we've got these higher speeds, we're actually able to, there's funding to put this infrastructure in place to reach these speeds so folks can be able to actually access the internet and do all the things that we take for granted on our computers these days. There's a couple other words I'd like to say is one's, and these are the definitions of, and it's easy to equate it to a road. This is kind of a convoluted start, but here we go. So we've got last mile, middle mile, and long haul. We're probably going to talk a little bit about the middle mile and last mile today. And in the sense of a multi-tenant dwelling unit, or in like a sense of a small community or a neighborhood, last mile is infrastructure that's in the building, if it's a larger building with multi-units in it, or in a small neighborhood where you might have built out like duplexes or single family homes. It's sort of the driveway, the small road to get to that neighborhood, and then the driveways. It's the part that brings that internet to your house from like a neighborhood road or from the main road. And then middle mile is the larger arterial streets within your community is the easiest way to think about that. So the bigger street, higher speeds, less stop signs, more through traffic, and that's going to have a bigger, you're going to have a bigger pipe for your internet as well off of that. And then that's going to break down into the neighborhoods and they get spread out along those lines, just like a road system would. So those are going to be, I'm going to use those phrases today, and I wanted to make sure that you understood them. If you do have questions about it, feel free to put it in the chat and we can answer them near the end. So thank you, Christa.
Thank you so much, Miriam. And
thank you for letting me be here. I totally forgot to say thanks initially.
Well, the handbook touches on some of these technical details, and since that was the topic that you ended on, I wanted to just bring the next question to you. The handbook speaks to different connectivity technologies to serve properties and then to serve individuals in unit, in their dwelling units with broadband. I've often heard your team say, though, that broadband planning decisions come down to questions of process and best fit. So in just a couple of minutes to emphasize for our audience, as they may consume this handbook and think about the application at their properties, what does that process and best fit experience really amount to?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a process. I think that's the easiest way to put it, is essentially you, the building owner or the management organization needs to work with somebody, likely, some other consultant, some folks in your community, but you need to do an assessment of what's the infrastructure in the building, what's the infrastructure adjacent and or near the building, and who owns that infrastructure? Is that an internet service provider or an ISP? Is it a local government network? Is it, an educational network? And then how do we, if that building is not connected to high-speed internet like fiber optics versus coaxial cable, which can be high-speed internet, or telephony like DSL copper phone lines. DSL stands for digital subscriber line, or I like to sometimes joke that it's darn slow landline. So see how the building's connected, and then what's in the vicinity that might be faster, better, or could be upgraded, or even just what's even there if the facility, building, neighborhood isn't well connected. And how far away is that infrastructure to your building or the facilities? Is it across a parking lot? Is there a park in the way? Is it across a road or things along, or is it a mile away? And all of that makes a difference on like what the best fit is. There's also, you want to look at what's in the building as well. How old is that infrastructure? Do things need to be replaced? What is the building made out of? That sounds funny, but concrete and masonry don't let wireless signals travel as well. And so that makes a difference on what the best fit, what the best solution is. And then also, who owns the infrastructure within the building? It could be an internet service provider. It could be the building itself. And can it be reused if it's older? And if so, then these are all like different sort of choose your own adventure books discussions. So it's like, okay, the infrastructure can be reused, but it's owned by the cable company. So then we do this instead of that. And then also, if it's owned by a different party than who owns the building or who manages the building, then when does it expire? When do those agreements expire? Does the building owner or management company want to have a competitive environment so the tenants or unit dwellers can then choose their own services? Or do you want to have like the best deal and create a contract for everybody in the building? So that all leads to what can be the best fit of it being a wired solution or maybe a wireless solution, depending upon all of those other variables. So super easy, just real fast to do.
Not complicated at all, right?
To check all that, to make sure that you're doing the best thing, and using the funding that is available to make the biggest difference for the folks living there.
Well, thank you for that comprehensive answer. And I do want to touch on the funding that's available, but I also want to lift up a point around the potential role of the developer or operator in what we might think of as tenant advocacy, right? So once the perfect infrastructure architecture is deployed, what is tenant participation, really uptake of this new potentially newer high capacity network look like? And maybe the way to frame that discussion, Michelle, would be around the inclusion in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of a very significant pot of money to support affordable connectivity, known as the Affordable Connectivity Program. What is that designed to achieve?
Yeah, thanks, Krista. Well, we know that historically many prior policies that looked at closing the digital divide were really focused solely on the expansion of the physical broadband infrastructure. And in doing so, they overlooked a critical issue that many Americans simply can't afford the services or the devices needed to use high quality broadband services. In fact, a recent analysis by Pew of low-income households earning less than $30,000 a year found that nearly 44% did not have broadband services, and almost half didn't have a traditional computer or tablet. And of those families, more than half attributed this to prohibitively expensive monthly costs. And so that's really stark when you think about households who earn more than 100,000. All of those things are nearly universally adopted. So when we're thinking about fostering digital inclusion, we also have to address the number one barrier to adoption, which in many cases is affordability. So that's what the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law's Affordable Connectivity Program, or ACP, seeks to address longer term. Because we know that even when consumers have access to physical broadband, it might not be affordable. So ACP is seeking to fill this gap by building on the prior temporary program, which you may remember called the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, by providing eligible consumers with a subsidy to assist them in affording internet service and a device to use it at home. And so we know that these low-cost options are essential to keeping down the cost of monthly bills and to helping to close the digital divide. And so that's what the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, who is charged with administering the ACP, is working to do. And so as part of that, they actually have an open comment period right now that LISC will be submitting comments on, where they're looking at setting up a potential pilot program, really focused on increasing awareness and enrollment of eligible households participating in the federal public housing assistance programs to increase uptake in ACP. We know that with EBB, there was lower enrollment than anticipated, and we want to make sure that all of the households who are eligible are being made aware of the ACP program, and that there's some streamlined approaches to how do we actually determine and provide automatic eligibility for that. And so that's what FCC is looking at, what we'll be providing comments on, to really encourage them to provide this automatic eligibility to simplify and reduce the administration burden, particularly when we're thinking about a tenant to live in this houses, but also for those who are the benefit administrators and the tenant service coordinators at the locations themselves. So this would look at properties like HUD Section 8 project-based rental assistance, Section 202, 811, and also programs at USDA.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Really helpful there. And this is a comprehensive piece of legislation. So in addition to ACP, significant dollars for broadband deployment, as Miriam alluded to, and that followed closely on the heels of $350 billion in American Rescue Plan Act dollars, which provided flexible funding for broadband, and with which as many as half the states are really allocating funds for broadband deployment. So Miriam, I would love for you to touch a little bit more on how these legislation, these two pieces of legislation address or prioritize broadband that serves multifamily housing, residential buildings. But as you're giving your answer, help folks understand that, at least as far as the infrastructure bill, these are resources that will devolve down to states, and states will have a great deal of latitude in determining how projects and programs will be developed to move broadband forward. So perhaps you could describe the role that housing managers might have in advocating up for these resources.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is really vital. So part of the Infrastructure Act required that, so as Michelle said, I'm going to back up a minute. So as Michelle said, a lot of this money is going to go to the states. And so there's a need to coordinate with the states. And actually in the Infrastructure Act, it requires the states do stakeholder engagement to make sure that grants set up by the states are equitable and attainable. So that's a huge component, is that your state is required to engage with their communities in some sort of stakeholder outreach requirement or engagement component. It doesn't outline how that has to happen. So that's where like advocacy can come in for these billions of dollars to make sure that your community gets its unfair share, to be able to retrofit or build new infrastructure, whether that be for an existing building or new development. So there isn't an easy way to do that. It depends on your state, and if you have an advocacy organization at the state level, but communicating up and making sure that there is there from your organization, from your counties, your municipalities, your councils of government, your regional economic development groups, state level organizations, your advocacy groups like that are all going to be very vital to this. And I believe actually Pew is doing a series of webinars for the states on how best to coordinate down as well. So there's a bunch of this happening. And I believe there is some resources on the, I'll stick it in the chat a little bit later, of some other resources to like easy overviews of what the programs are and things like that too, because it's a lot of money and it's complicated and it's 1,000 pages or more. And no, I doubt any of us in this room have read the entire thing. I haven't. So so there's what's called the BEAD section, which is the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. And that allows for That's where the ACP that Michelle mentioned lives, but that also allows for retrofitting of existing infrastructure. So there's funding to do the retrofitting in that component. And that's $42.5 billion. That's going to be divided among the states. Each state is expected to get at least $100 million. And then there's also separate funding for tribal connectivity. And there's the Digital Equity Act itself, which is $2.75 billion, and that's also going to be going through the states. And that's that component to make sure the folks know how to use the internet and know how to operate a computer or a tablet to be able to do so, and how to be safe online so grandma doesn't get scammed as well, things like that. One of the other things that I saw at the beginning of the pandemic were some of the nonprofits in our community helping with the access to devices. Where I live, it was our United Way was doing that. So working with our nonprofit partners can help us with some of the equity components too, in that device type of thing that may not be the best role for a housing developer, a housing manager. So creating those partnerships will really help. And then those partnerships can strengthen the advocacy at the state level.
Yeah, thank you. Since you said that, I want to let the audience know that Rural LISC has a digital navigator program that was launched during the pandemic and now touches 34 organizations in 20 states. And some of the most memorable insights that our partners that have deployed this work have shared are really this idea of leveraging partnerships and finding common cause with other organizations. And so whether when the nonprofit partner or the community-based organization is the implementer of a digital navigator solution, they're reaching out and finding touch points to K-12 or the economic development delivery system or other important stakeholders and figuring out what the total strategy could look like. And I'm thinking of a particular anecdote from northeastern Alabama, where the digital navigator partner, which was the Chamber of Commerce, described being able to reach the top of the mountain together because there was recognition that different stakeholders had a role in doing this work, and the collaborative effort would get folks across the finish line. So I'd love to just get your perspective, Michelle, on the possibilities around community-based organizations really engaging with state-level entities to advance the broadband agenda. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot can be done when we're thinking about collaboration, particularly between community-based organizations and housers, and thinking about states' qualified allocation plans and how they may or may not be uplifting digital inclusion as a piece of that. So first off, if state plans don't have digital inclusion as a part of it, making sure that we're pushing that that's included. And if it is included, to make sure that it's being uplifted and incentivized as much as possible so we can make sure that we're addressing the pressing issues. I also think thinking more broadly, as you all were mentioning, about how states and advocates can really work together to advocate and align goals of the different plans, but also the new buckets of money that are coming out under the bipartisan infrastructure, so that we're aligning approaches that are maximizing our available resources and at the same time fostering greater access, adoption, and affordability. I think a piece of that, though, is going to require some robust capacity building investments to really equip historically underinvested populations and organizations that may not already have the organizational capacity to really collaborate with institutional partners at the state, regional, or local levels. And so I think that's going to be a continued thread that we're going to see. And I appreciate the mention of Q's efforts, because I think that's something that's really going to require having a broader set of stakeholders coming to the table if we're looking to advance universal service. And making sure that as states are pulling together their plans, that they'll be submitting to NTIA, the National Telecommunications Information Administration, my acronym caught myself, that it's not just the same stakeholders that are at the table, and that really with this historic investment that we're thinking about, how do we build broader, how do we build bigger, and how do we build better?
Yeah, right on. So you're seeing developers, asset managers, service coordinators working together to address broadband gaps at the level of the properties, and then really zooming out to the level of community, bringing stakeholders together to sort of braid resources and strategy to craft the total vision, right? So how can this infrastructure really help move this community forward? So it's a very powerful message. We just have a couple of minutes left. Miriam, I'm going to put you slightly on the spot to recall all that good, rich detail in the housing handbook, and leave our audience before we go into Q&A with the first 3 steps, right? So if you're a developer or an asset manager in the audience today that wants to assess connectivity issues at your properties, what are your first 3 steps? And you can say, call us, but. Oh.
Call somebody who's not on the spot. But it's really now you've got me trying to remember what I wrote way back when. It's gonna be assessing what you need, assessing what you have, or I should say assessing what you have, assessing what you need, and then working with partners to fill those gaps. That's essentially what we need to do. And those needs are going to vary, and those solutions are going to vary, and those gaps are going to be different in each community and for each houser and for the needs of the residents. But that's really where to go. And you can totally tell me if I'm completely wrong, Christa. But that's essentially the overall umbrella. And then how you do all those things has all sorts of different flavors based on your location. And I think one of our first steps in here is community and stakeholder engagement. So that's probably the phrase of the day is work with your partners, stakeholder engagement, and involve the residents, involve the community to understand what those needs are. That's one of the main tenets of all this funding, is that engagement, is to do it a little bit more grassroots versus top down, to make sure that we solve the problems that we actually have, and it's not a prescriptive environment.
Right. Yeah, there's a very powerful idea there of grassroots up. So right, to summarize, assessing what you have, assessing what you need, and determining what partnerships look like. I think that's a very fair summary of what's in the handbook, plus a lot of other technical detail, and we certainly invite our audience to read it and reach out to the Rural LISC team to share your comments, your reactions, your insights now, and certainly in the future. So Tim, I'm happy to turn it back over to you if there are questions in the Q&A feature here for the panel.
Yeah, not yet.
Oh.
Not yet. I think people are still thinking, digesting everything that's been discussed, and thinking of their questions or their reactions.
Very good. We're certainly happy to take questions now, and contact information is on the website for the Rural LISC team, in the handbook, and Miriam, perhaps you'd be willing to share your contact information as well.
Absolutely. I will stick my contact information in the chat. Trying to think, I'm sure there's something in there that I missed, but I tried to keep it not too technical. So when I would recommend make sure that when folks are doing this, they engage with somebody, an entity, a partner of some sort that can help them with the technical component, that can do some of the engineering when we get towards funding, because that's going to be a vital need. It's like, great, we need this infrastructure, now what?
Yeah. So a question did just come in, Tim. I happened to see it, so
Sure.
I might send that one to Michelle, and certainly would love you to respond from the perspective of the Rural LISC Digital Navigator Network, but also the National LISC FOC network, that is making a significant contribution as far as offering digital inclusion support. So as the questioner asked, is there any concern that affordable housing managers won't have the capacity to advocate for digital inclusion efforts? And so where might they seek alliances in the community?
Yeah, I think there definitely is concern about the ability to meet the host of needs that residents have and the host of potential benefits they might be eligible for. And that has always historically been a challenge, right? Whether we're thinking about SNAP, EITC, a number of income-based credits that individuals aren't always accessing what they're eligible for. And so how do you close that gap? And that's part of why we're pushing and hoping to see FCC really stand up this pilot program that would streamline the eligibility and make it automatic for those eligible households who are living in affordable housing, because we think that there's a lot more simple solutions to the problems that we have rather than adding in additional administrative hoops and barriers. And so that being a first step. I think to your second question, yeah, for sure. Financial opportunity centers and other organizations that are really working on and historically have been working on how do you close the gaps to income benefits. That this is a critical piece of it, and that individuals have the information that they need. And I think that involves a train the trainer approach. And so looking at when we have our community-based organizations, how are those who are helping and providing some of the financial coaching and guidance, do they have all the information that they need? Are they well versed in the program and the eligibility and in navigating any pushback they might get from internet service providers, and equipping their clients to feel confident, that this program is going to be here. It's going to be here long term. I think there's, some broader hesitation because emergency broadband benefit was temporary. So there's a big piece of education that I think still needs to be done. And I think FCC is starting to recognize that, and part of the comments they're putting out is also in coordination and thinking through what could an outreach grant program look like to really facilitate the outreach and making sure that households who are eligible know that they're eligible, and when possible, that their eligibility is determined automatically. So I do think that that's a concern. It's a great question, and thinking through what are the potential resources that we can direct to help them build out the capacity to do it and simplify it when possible.
Yeah. Yeah, so one nugget I'm hearing there is take your time, stimulate the coordination, but also now is the time, right? This is an unprecedented moment. Tim, were there any other questions?
I think there are, and I'll pose it really to all of you. We've heard the word partners and partnerships throughout this conversation. So when you think about partners, are you thinking about partners maybe from the building side, so the housing development community, housing owners, operators, asset managers? Are you thinking about it from the broadband side, right, the actual providers, or maybe both?
Miriam, do you have some thoughts there?
They're bouncing around a little bit. I'm trying to make them into cohesive thoughts. Partnerships should be with your local providers as well. Most of the time, I've found that people or entities that are not already in that business don't usually want to get into it. It's hard and technical and requires staffing up and a whole lot of other framework around it. So when you're thinking about those partnerships, those should also be your local internet service providers. And how do you want to engage with them? Is it something that the building needs to own the infrastructure, or the houser needs to own the infrastructure, and then you lease that out and you let that internet service provider provide the service through that at a lower cost potentially because they didn't have to build the infrastructure? Like, there's lots of ways to kind of get to an affordable solution through a public-private partnership, or a public-public partnership, depending upon your location and what infrastructure is nearby, and your state's rules and regulations about public engagement and broadband, things like that. Or it can even be a public-private partnership. Maybe the municipality has some infrastructure that you can lease, and then you build some in the building, and then we lease it and you engage with a private partner. So there's lots of ways you can smash a lot of P's together in an acronym, essentially.
So I'll pose maybe one more question before we close out. And it's a comment really that appears in the chat, but I'll maybe spin it into a question. In many rural communities, affordable housing is developed by by a nonprofit organization that maybe solely focuses on housing. And as someone who considers himself a houser, broadband, it sometimes feels very intimidating and overly technical to me. So for those who are listening, who are really more housing developers, maybe where's a good place to start to even ground themselves in some of these concepts and the language and the approaches?
That's a great question. I mean, I think for me, my background is also less technical. It would start with identifying, I think like Miriam said, where are the gaps and what are the pieces? And so figuring out where it is that you need to lean in. Is there the existing infrastructure and it really is an adoption and affordability issue? Is it that people have it, but they're maybe not fully utilizing it to reach the benefits? And so maybe it's a skills and training issue that could be solved by a digital navigator program, or if it really is that the infrastructure is just not there and it needs to be built out. So I would start with asking those questions to try to identify and take it a little bit more piecemeal, so you can figure out which piece of this digital inclusion puzzle that you're seeking to solve. And I guess, sometimes it probably will be all of the above, but deciding then and strategizing when you can in partnership with your local government to really think about what is their plan and how can you be a part of that and complement that with your programs and your services that you're carrying out in your rural county. That's where I would start with it. Christa or Miriam, I'm sure you might have other thoughts on that.
Yeah, especially if it's like a county-wide nonprofit or a multi-county nonprofit, work with the counties, the municipalities, but also other support organizations that you work with already. Is that a United Way? Is there a community foundation? It's interesting how many other entities have started to work in the broadband space in the last 2 years. And that can be illuminating as well. But to Tim's point, it can be very technical and feel very overwhelming very quickly. So I think one of the ideas behind the handbook was to make it not super technical initially, because knowing that's hard to engage with. It's going to turn a lot of people off who aren't technical folks. And just so you know, the only reason I ended up in this is that I was working as a town planner and I was the youngest person in the building. And so they're like, about broadband, about computers, you can do broadband. So don't be afraid to ask the stupid questions to your colleagues. You're like, I don't know what that means. There's also a lot of resources on Broadband USA. I can plunk a couple in the grant into the chat, but there are resources for local entities to learn about sort of just the nuts and bolts of broadband. Also, if there's an entity doing broadband stuff that's not necessarily an internet service provider, they can maybe do a broadband 101 for the elected and appointed officials in your community, including the housers and anybody else who's got a touch point in there. Use your local community resources. Your state may have that as well, because the states are required to create a broadband office as part of the Infrastructure Act. And part of that outreach and engagement is going to have to be helping bring everybody up to the same level, the same page, if you will.
Miriam, is there a deadline for establishment of those state offices? So our partners would know at a certain point in time they should at least at a minimum be able to reach out to a state office?
Yeah, a lot of states are underway if they don't already have a broadband office.
Okay.
States, so the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, the NTIA, has their notice of funding opportunity, will be released in mid-May. And then the states have until, I want to say September sometime, to put together their plan of how they're going to spend their $100 million. And that includes the digital equity component. So that's kind of your rough timeline.
Great. Well, I do want to make sure that our attendees know that links to some resources and references have been posted in the chat. So if you haven't grabbed those yet, please do. Miriam put a few in there along with her contact information. And then a few times throughout the chat, I've dropped the link in to an abridged version of this technical guide that we've been discussing. If there's anyone participating that would like to get even more into the weeds, we can certainly do that with you in a very focused conversation to better assess exactly what it is you're hoping to do at your property. So before I formally close this out, Christa or any of our or Michelle or Miriam, any final thoughts in these remaining 3 minutes?
Thank you so much. Tim, I think this has been a great conversation. I just want to express my gratitude to Miriam and Michelle again for their insights, and very much welcome calls, emails to talk about this topic further. I certainly never grow tired of it. And I imagine the same thing is true for Michelle and Miriam. But just to really emphasize the point that now is a great time to start, right? And our Digital Navigator program does include a Broadband 101. We've appreciated when folks have lifted up, how helpful it was to just get a little exposure to the technical, but then to demonstrate their visibility, right? I'm working on this issue and I'm looking for, other members of the community that are engaged as well, and how can we move forward together? And really quite impressed with this Ruralist Digital Navigator Network. They are interfacing with the internet service providers in their markets, building those relationships, having those conversations, doing the outreach with local officials, and really demonstrating what is possible. So good luck, to everybody in the audience today. This is exciting work to take on, and we'll be glad to hear from you on your, as far as your broadband journey is concerned.
Yeah, great. So Christa, Michelle, Miriam, thank you for sharing your knowledge and your insights on this timely and increasingly important topic. And I also want to say a special thank you to Keegan McChesney for his behind the scenes work to ensure a smooth webinar today. And lastly, thank you to our participants for joining the first installment of our new Raising the Roof webinar series. If you have ideas or suggestions for future topics, we'd love to hear them. So please email Keegan McChesney. His email address is in the chat as well as on the screen. So we'll leave that up there for just a few more seconds. But again, thank you all for your participation, for your attention, and enjoy the rest of your day.